This evening, we're talking with Josh Freeman, um, who is a distinguished professor of history at Queens College and has a bunch of other titles, one of which has to do with urban studies at CUNY, City University of New York. He's the author of many books, including a terrific book on the history of the factory called Behemoth, which isn't read as much as it should be. And several other books, but his most famous work, I think, and my favorite, is called Working Class New York, Life and Labor Post-World War II. So that's Josh, and I'll ask him a question. Why a book on garden apartments? When your previous work has been on labor and working class history, how does this book relate to your earlier work and to working class studies?
Yeah, well, first let me say thank you for inviting me. And I think it does, there is some connections here. I was always a bit interested in housing because it always seemed to me that if you wanted to understand working people's experience and labor movements, you couldn't just look at the workplace. You had to look at the community and the homes in which people lived and that aspect of their lives too. Um, I think the very first paper I ever wrote in graduate school was on company towns. So, I've always had some interest in this, but what really got me connected was a more immediate experience. As you mentioned, Jack, I lived for a long time. I worked for a long time at Queens College. Queens College in New York is surrounded by garden apartments. And I would walk past these places. I pay no attention whatsoever to them. They're not all that much to look at. They were just part of the background. And for some reason, a few years ago, one day I started thinking, those are actually affordable housing there, and it's kind of old and it looks in pretty good shape. And, what's the story here? I mean, New York, like so much of the country, has this terrible affordability crisis. And it belatedly occurred to me, I was completely surrounded by affordable housing built 50, 60 years ago. And I thought, like, what's the history? Why and how did they get built? Who built it? Why do all these projects look the same? So I thought, I should learn something. It occurred to me, I'm a historian. It suddenly belatedly occurred to me, there's a history here. What is it? And it turned out that no one's ever written anything about this. So I just decided maybe I'd do it myself. So one thing led to another, and that's really where the book came from, the effort to understand what was actually the immediate environment of where I worked.
Cool.
Hmm.
So, if you can define garden apartments and well, and tell us about some of them that we have
Yeah.
pictures of here. So,
Yeah, I just
what is a garden
happy.
apartment?
Yeah, happy to do that. And one of the things I've learned working on this project is when you mention garden apartments, half the people you talk to, or maybe much more than that, have no idea what you're talking about, or they use the word in a different way. So let me explain what I mean by garden apartment, and what this book is about. And that picture is good because I think it has all the fundamental features of a garden apartment. That picture is of something called the Buckingham community. It's in Arlington, Virginia. This was built by a private company in 1936, but it was built with an FHA mortgage insurance. So this was facilitated by the federal government. It was the largest FHA mortgage insurance in the United States before World War II. And this was designed and co-developed by an architect named Henry Wright, who was the sort of one of the key developers of this idea of the garden apartment. And as you can see here, typically garden apartments are low-rise buildings, usually 2 or 3 stories high. Um, they typically, and you can see in the side buildings here, have entryways that access from the outside 2 or 4 apartments. Usually you walk in an entryway, there are apartments on either side, you go up a staircase, and there are 2 more apartments. So there are no internal hallways. And this was a way of giving a little bit more privacy than having a long hallway in a typical apartment building. It's also less expensive. You're not building space that's not used very much. But it also has some design advantages. I live in an apartment building. It's got a big corridor, and the apartments come off one side or the other of the hallway. That means you only have windows on one side of your apartment. Building this way means that you have windows and light on both sides. And if you open your windows on both sides, you got cross ventilation. I remember my grandmother always talked about cross ventilation. Now in the world of air conditioning, people don't think about cross ventilation. So this is a very, very typical design. The other thing that's critical to garden apartments that you see here is that they are typically on large sites in which the building takes up a relatively small percentage of the space. So they're garden apartments. They have a lot of green areas around them. And very often they're set up this way around courtyards. Cars are kept away. They're kept on the periphery of these projects to separate vehicular and pedestrian traffic, which meant that you could have safe play areas and gathering areas. Typically, the kitchens faced into the courtyards, and it meant that parents, mostly mothers, could kick the kids outside. They could play in the courtyard. They didn't have to worry about cars. It was explicitly meant to create community, and there were usually shared playgrounds, laundry rooms, sometimes more facilities. So this is like a founding one. Yeah, go to the next one. That looks almost the same, except that it's in color. It's actually built, a dozen years later. This is in Queens, New York. It's called Bell Park Gardens. All these places have these ridiculous, meaningless names, Bell Park Gardens. What's interesting is the physical form is directly derived from Buckingham Community and the earlier projects. This is a co-op. It was a co-op from the start. When it was created in 1948, the New York State government promoted the creation of a co-op. And the politics are fascinating. Among the groups that joined together to sponsor this was a sort of proto-union. It was the Benevolent Association of New York City Firemen and the American Legion, And the state government that was promoting this was not some New Deal government. Thomas Dewey was the governor of New York, but this was seen as an alternative to public housing, cooperative housing. So garden apartments may be physically similar, but they can have different ownership forms. And quite a few of them are cooperatives. Now, yeah, go to the next one. That's good. This is in California. It's called Lincoln Place. I put this in to show that not all of them look the same. And there were actually opportunities for more inventive design. This is in Venice, California, which today, if you know LA, it's like a very fancy, expensive neighborhood. But it used to be a working class industrial area. There was a huge Douglas aircraft plant that was very near where this project was. And I'm sure many of these Douglas aircraft workers lived in this project. It was built right after World War II. It was designed by a guy named Ralph Vaughan, who I had never heard of till I started working on this. Ralph Vaughan was one of the most prominent African-American architects of his generation. And you could see it's much more inventive than the earlier examples visually. It's got like these kind of modernist touches. So it sort of suggests that you could do more with garden apartments, even though most of them look like the other ones. So let's go to the next one. This takes us into the third kind of garden apartment. There were privately owned ones like Buckingham. There were co-ops, and there were government financed. And I think as many of you know, with the coming of the New Deal, for the first time, the federal government got involved in building housing. And this was initially done through the Public Works Administration. And their first plan was to lend money at very favorable terms to nonprofit entities that would actually build the housing. And this was the model that was very widely used in Europe. And the New Deal was very aware of what was going on in Europe. And this was a social housing program of the European kind. And this is my favorite of all these early New Deal projects. This is called the Carl Mackley Houses. It's in Philadelphia. It's still there. It was sponsored by the American Federation of Hosiery Workers. Its name, Carl Mackley, was a union member who had been killed in a strike a few years before this was built. So they built this project in his name. with federal money. All the money came from the federal government. It was designed by two German-born architects named Alfred Kasner and Oscar Stoneroff. And interestingly, Stoneroff later became very close to the UAW. So the same guy who designed this designed the UAW headquarters in Detroit, and he designed Black Lake. If you know Black Lake,
Yeah.
UAW retreat. And Stoneroff, who was the co-designer of this project, died in the same plane crash as Walter Reuther. The two of them and their wives were flying to Black Lake while it was under construction. So this is totally intertwined with the labor movement. The design was very similar to what was going on in Germany, parallel low-rise buildings, lots of green space. And this had a ton of community facilities. It had a co-op nursery, co-op laundry room, an auditorium. And as you can see in this picture, it had a swimming pool. And this is like amazing to me. So this is federal government funding housing for blue collar workers with a swimming pool, and that's like a political statement as much as a architectural statement. So this was the first version of public housing. It was short-lived. Let's go to the next one. Because very quickly the federal government decided it couldn't scale up with that model of having nonprofits build the stuff. There just weren't enough that knew what they were doing. So the federal government decided it was going to build housing itself. And that's the origins of what we think of as public housing, and that starts in the mid-1930s and continues on. Most people think of public housing as high rises, and so forth. But this is obviously not a photograph. It's a painting of a public housing project that was built with federal funds under the Housing Act of 1937. The project's called Wentworth Gardens. It's in Chicago. It's near where the White Sox play. And you could see in that painting is low rise. It looks just like the other garden apartments. So you have public, co-op, private, all kind of looking similar. I love this painting. I just love this painting because to me it captures the best side of garden apartments. It is by Kerry James Marshall, one of my favorite painters, still alive. The title of the painting is in the painting. It's called Better Homes, Better Gardens, and I don't know if you could see, but in the top of the painting, there are bluebirds of happiness flying around, So for James Kerry Marshall, the garden department and public housing was happiness, it was opportunity. So this is a direct visual political intervention about the history of public housing and garden apartments, which I think is quite consciously designed to rebut the notion that government housing was a disaster, and also rebut the idea that public housing was only high rises. That in fact, what you see in this painting is much more typical of what public housing in America was like. So this gives you at least a little bit of a taste of some of the varieties of what garden apartments were like.
It turns out that Betsy, Josh, and I all spent some portion of our childhood in garden apartments, and the one I was in was sturdy brick. It's still there. Sizable living room, tiny bedrooms, and everything was cement and tile, and we couldn't put carpet down. And we lived there from 1952, just after it was built, to 1955, when I believe, I don't know this for sure, but I believe that my father was a steelworker, and I think his wage was too good to be in the public housing project. Betsy?
The one that I lived in, kind of preschool, just for a few years preschool, looked exactly like that one, that first one you showed with the brick around rectangular around a grassy courtyard. It looked basically exactly like that.
Yeah. I lived in two different ones that looked exactly like that. One in across from Philadelphia in Haddonfield called Walworth Park Gardens, and then one in Queens called Grand Central. One of the reasons they all look the same is that the federal government was insuring these mortgages. So if the developer didn't pay back the bank, the federal government would pay the bank back. So the federal government said, look, if we're going to insure your mortgage, we want to regulate what this thing is like to protect the taxpayers' money, but also to set standards for tenants. So to get an FHA mortgage, you had to meet FHA guidelines, and they were extremely specific. And that first picture I showed you of Buckingham Gardens, Buckingham Community, was one of the ones that was kind of a template. So there's a standardization. It's part of an effort to quickly scale up. And it means they're kind of boring looking. They all look the same. But it was really a conscious strategy to create minimum standards, protect money, and build fast. So they're not each individualized. They all basically working from a very similar plan. I have very good memories of living in a garden apartment. It was back in the day when, your parents, kicked you out and said, leave me alone, go play with the other kids. And you'd step outside and there'd be a million kids in this courtyard and there were no cars anyplace. And at some point, everyone's mother would stick their head out and scream, dinner, and you go back in. So it was kind of a paradise for me as a kid. It was really great. Very typically, I think, unlike both Betsy and Jack, we didn't live there forever. My sister and I got older. We shared a bedroom. My parents thought, at some point we should each have our own bedroom. And they moved a couple miles away in a single family home. Their income had gone up a little bit. They could afford that. That's a very typical trajectory. It's often a way station for upwardly mobile working class families.
Yeah.
Okay. Josh, the basic narrative of public housing isn't that it's got a mixed record, but that it's a disaster and absolute proof of the superiority of the private sector and the market in providing housing. But you argue that government involvement in fostering the garden apartment was, quote, a massive successful experiment in state-sponsored housing. How was that?
Well, I talk about two different kinds of government involvement in housing in this book. And one of the things I did, and I sort of stumbled into doing it, was I wrote about both private and public housing in the same book. That's actually very unusual. They're usually siloed off completely differently. But in fact, it's all government housing because, the several, maybe 400,000 privately built garden apartments would not have been built without government intervention. So one type of government involvement in housing, which we rarely acknowledge, is the subsidization of privately owned housing through, mortgage insurance, tax breaks, lots of other. And that could be single family homes, but it also could be rental buildings. And that was extraordinarily successful, but rarely acknowledged because we like to present as our national myth that sort of home ownership and building ownership is the result of individual striving and hard work. This is the ultimate reward. You get your house. So to say, yeah, you get your house because the federal government made it possible, kind of messes that up. But that's now the other story is the one that people do acknowledge public housing is, and Jack, as you say, most people think of it completely negatively. And look, there were problems with some of these projects and they grew over time. But overall, especially in the beginning, for so many American families, these were a godsend. I start the book, the very first story I tell is Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi. He was very little. His family moved to Memphis. He and his parents shared one room in a boarding house. The toilet was in the hall. They cooked on a hot plate. Then they got into public housing. It was a garden apartment public housing project run by the Memphis Housing Authority. It's still there. It was transformative. Life got so much better. Eventually, like Jack, like your family, they made too much money, they had to move out. But most people think not of those projects. They think of the high-rise projects like, Igo Pruitt in St. Louis or Robert Taylor houses, which were very problematic and we also used politically to discredit public housing. Now, were there problems in public housing, including garden apartment ones? Absolutely. I think it was primarily from chronic underfunding. and also the fact that increasingly a program which was originally conceived of as serving a broad sector of the working class and the lower middle class became increasingly restricted to the very poor. And this was the result of pressure from the real estate industry that didn't want competition from the government. The real estate industry, real estate people can't build money for the really poor and make money. So they're perfectly happy to let that be in public housing. But they didn't want competition anyplace else. So you got under-maintained, aging buildings for the extreme poor. And that was, in many cases, problematic. In lots of cases, it wasn't. But, the failure stories were used as a bludgeon to discredit public housing. And about, a third of it was literally bulldozed down. Atlanta, which had the very first federally funded public housing project, is one of many cities today that literally bulldoze down every single public housing project. They simply don't exist. So I think there was an ideological component in the negative view, as well as a reflection of real problems.
I see Muriel's got your hand up. Do you want to, before we move on, do you want to say something, Muriel?
Yeah, I was just going to speak to the issue that you actually just raised about maintenance. So tell us about the maintenance of those earlier garden apartments, because I gather that deferred maintenance was a big problem with the high rises.
Yeah, I mean, some of it has to do with the funding formulas from the government and how they changed over time. But you know, if you're going to have capped rents, you often need subsidies, ongoing subsidies to maintain, housing in good shape. And particularly for public housing, serving a poor population that can't pay above a certain level of rate, unless you subsidize on an ongoing basis that housing, the natural turn by management is to simply cut maintenance and routine needs, and garbage piles up and light bulbs don't get fixed. And if it's a high rise, the elevator doesn't get fixed and people get pissed off. The whole notion of social housing as it developed in Europe was that it was rental housing at below market rates. And to do that, you have to subsidize it. And it's not just construction subsidies. You often have to do that on an ongoing basis. Public housing was not something like Social Security or Medicare that's virtually universal and therefore has a big political block of support, right? It was by design for only a segment of the population, and a pretty politically disenfranchised segment of the population, and therefore, the politics of public housing is a politics that says, like, don't spend my taxpayer money on those people, and so I think chronic underfunding is a massive problem in public housing.
Right. Yeah, I'm curious about the so many of these garden apartments were private developments,
Yeah.
and as you say, the FHA mortgages, they got public help, government help to be created.
Yeah.
But how was the government policy able to keep the rents low when it's a private landlord?
Well, that's an interesting question. First of all, to my amazement, the contract that the developer had to sign when they got a FHA insured mortgage for, let's say, a 600 unit garden apartment they were building, gives the government the right to set the rents. That's probably the terms of the mortgage insurance. Now, I don't know how often the federal government actually did it, but the idea that the federal government took that right unto itself is really quite remarkable. But obviously, they got very cheap financing. The other thing, though, is not necessarily directly, and sometimes they got tax exemptions, particularly real estate tax exemptions from local. But the other thing is not directly the government. It's sort of how they were built. You have to step back here. Till World War II, or certainly till the 30s, almost all housing in America was custom built. If you were going to build housing, you have a single lot. You got a designer for a single house. You had a builder come in and build that single unit, buying just enough supplies for that one thing, right? garden apartments were designed as whole communities, hundreds of units, sometimes in a few cases, thousands of units that were designed and built at the same time. They were designed as modules that were repeated over and over again. So design costs were kept low. You had mass purchasing, and you had a high level of division of labor in the construction. And one of the experts at the time said, if you combine that with cheap financing, that cuts costs by about 30%. So you really are starting with a much lower initial investment that can go a long way to capping rents. Now, it's not as if rents weren't an issue in many places. Landlords did try to raise rents, and sometimes there were big fights. And a number of cities, including like New York and Los Angeles, instituted rent control that covered garden apartments, among other rental buildings.
Good point.
Betsy, let's skip to your next question.
Okay. I also just wanted to stick in. I don't know if anybody else on this call was familiar with the expiring use housing program a little later, that were private developers who got favorable terms in exchange for keeping the rents affordable to 30% of tenants' income for 20 years. And then when the 20 years was up, we had to organize, I was a tenant organizer, we had to organize tenant buyouts to keep them affordable. And that succeeded in many parts of the country. So, so because on the theory, what they said in the 60s when they put these in 20 years, we won't have a housing shortage. And then, of course, in the 80s, it was way, way, way worse. So, so you're talking about the 1940s, there was a severe housing shortage, as there is today. I don't know if you can say whether it's better or worse, but how does the 40s housing shortage compare to today? In what ways was it worse then? And the big difference to me is now we don't really have the political will to fix it, but we did then. So if you can tell some of that story.
Yeah, that's really interesting. First of all, I'd say it was worse. As bad as it is now, it was worse. And I think part of the problem is you just have to roll back the years. Very little housing was built during the Depression, even with the New Deal efforts. And then literally no civilian housing was built during World War II. So by the time you get to 1945, you've got, over 15 years of virtually no residential construction. And then you have the war. So there are 12 million Americans going to the armed forces. Mostly they're young people. Many of them had been living with their families. They go off to war. They come back. There's no place for them to live. They want to start families. They want to have kids. They want to get married. There's no place to go. So there's if you look at, occupancy rates, the percentage of empty, buildings in major cities, they're unbelievably infinitesimal. There's almost no empty. So there's a tremendous crisis. The political will, I think, in my view, comes from the fact that so many of the people involved are veterans. And they're not shy about saying, you sent us off to war, and now we have no place to live. In New York State, a veterans group occupied the New York State legislature, the physical building, demanding that there be a special session on housing. And there were demonstrations in other cities, So there's a sense that there's a kind of moral and political claim that veterans have, and this is very similar to the GI Bill, if you stop and think about it. The GI Bill is this sort of social democratic program that's passed when the left is in retreat, right? It's the beginning of the eve of the Cold War, the left. So, and yet this is very social democratic program, but it's a social democratic program only for vets, right? It's not for everybody. Well, the housing programs in many ways are quite similar. So most of the federally supported, certainly the federally supported private garden apartments were by agreement had to be for World War II veterans and their families. And they're often percentages, 90%, 75%, of the units had to be reserved for veterans, in some cases, all of them. So the specific character of the claim of veterans, I think had the effect of extending the New Deal into the post-war period in this area of housing in a way that didn't happen in most other areas of American life. In general, the New Deal was in retreat. Things were moving towards a more privatized market system. But in this one particular area, you got this great deal of government intervention. By the mid 50s, it pretty much stops, at least for rental housing, because Congress decides that, the housing crisis is easing. Let's turn it back to the private market. So it's a very specific moment. But in that specific moment, a great deal of housing was built and built very quickly. And most of it's still around. And most of it's still around serving working people.
From the history of garden apartments, Josh, what do we learn about how to address our housing crisis today? I know you're not supposed to ask historians those kinds of questions.
Yeah. I mean, we live in a different moment. We don't live in 1935. We don't live in 1945, and the solutions and the possibilities are different. To me, the biggest lesson, and this sounds so elementary and stupid, but is that you actually can do something. I mean, I feel like in the city I live in and in the country, like we are in this gridlock society. Nothing happens. I mean, private development happens, but nothing of social consequence seems to be able to happen. And to do the simplest thing seems overwhelming and exhausting. And the history I write about is of how seemingly tractable problems like affordable housing were in the past addressed, and they were addressed through social mobilization and the mobilization of social forces through the government, in some cases directly, in some cases promoting private activity. And so just the biggest lesson to me is you can actually do things, that we have a history of doing things and we could do things again. Now, the physical form, the specific financing mechanisms and so forth that we might want to draw on today, would probably be different. And we also have many technological advances that we can draw on that were not available in 1935 or 1945. But I think that the idea that the state can work to promote decent housing for everyone, that's something that was embarked on in the past, and I think we can embark on again.
Cool. So you're in New York City at this particular moment in history where the Mamdani administration has laid out this very ambitious sounding housing program. Can you describe it, and what do you think its prospects are for
Yeah.
being going into
Yeah.
effect?
Well, I'm not a great expert on this, but I'll give it a shot. First of all, you have to remember that the vast majority of people in New York live in rental housing. So New York, compared to most cities, a lot of cities like LA also, the bulk of residents now live in rental housing. But in New York, it's a very high percentage. So there are two aspects of the program, rental and construction. Rental was central to Mamdani's campaign. He ran on the idea of freezing the rent in rent regulated apartments, and there are 1 million rent stabilized apartments in New York City, 1 million. So this is not a minor thing. And he also said that he called for the production of 200,000 units of permanently affordable government subsidized apartments to be built over 10 years using union labor. Now, this is very ambitious. I have to say it's not quite as radical as it sounds. Under an earlier mayor, Bill de Blasio, rent stabilized apartments were frozen in 2015, 2016, 2020. And I got to say, every incoming mayor says, I'm going to build hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing. So, you got to dig a little bit deeper. On the rental side, I think the prospects for success are very high. Mamdani has already appointed a majority of the members of the board that sets the rent rates for rent stabilization. I think they will freeze the rent. He's also just launched this thing, which it's kind of amazing in a way. They've the New York City government has set up a series of hearings called the rental ripoff hearings. And they're in every borough. They've had 3 so far. And all the commissioners, and in one case, Mamdani himself, they show up in like some high school auditorium or whatever they use. And people come and everyone gets 3 minutes to complain about their situation. And so it's kind of a theater in a way. They promoting it as kind of fact finding. It's like venting. But for the official city government to have the rental ripoff hearings, it's kind of amazing. One other thing I'd say about rental, which again shows you how ambitious they are. Just as soon as he became mayor, Mamdani tried to intervene in a bankruptcy case. A lot of rental housing in New York is being bought up by these big corporations, and they're often slumlords. They're terrible. And one was going bankrupt, and it was in bankruptcy court, and there'd been a tentative agreement to sell these apartments to another terrible corporation that had a record. So the New York City government tried to intervene to block the sale, which was an extraordinary thing to do. It didn't work. The bankruptcy judge said New York City didn't have standing to intervene in the case, but it shows you how they're thinking. So that's the rental side, and I'm very optimistic. The construction side seems much less certain to me. It's all very vague. Building housing is really expensive. Where are you going to get the money? I think in the past, the city government has turned to private developers and said, we'll give you rights to build more housing as long as you build some affordable. Mamdani, I think, has indicated he'll do some of that. He would love to get the federal government involved. Some of you may saw, he went down to Washington, had this kind of wacko meeting with the president, I'm not so optimistic about either of those things, to tell you the truth. I don't think either the federal government or the private sector is really going to be that interested in building affordable housing that stays affordable forever. So I think there's going to have to be more planning on this. And so I think it's very uncertain. I will say, this is getting a little into the weeds, but it's really interesting. I think it's important to talk about. I think behind the scenes, there are some Mamdani housing people who have a very radical analysis of the situation that goes far beyond what's being said publicly and what previous liberal Democrats have said. And what they think is that the landlords and the conservatives are right when they say freezing rents is going to drive a lot of buildings into bankruptcy. And furthermore, the conservative argument is you do rent control, no one's going to build rental apartments because they're not going to make money. And privately, a lot of Mamdani people say they're right, and that's a good thing, right? These buildings are going to go bankrupt, and either we'll take them over or they'll be resold by bankruptcy court as a much lower price than they exist now. That the cost of housing was driven up by speculation, and you can't sustain those values with rents, without milking people. So their attitude's great. Let them all go bankrupt, and either we'll take them over or, new owners will come in buying them at bargain basement prices, and they'll be able to sustain those buildings at lower rents. Now that's something that no one really wants to say out loud, but we'll see what happens. And then on the construction
Josh, can I
side,
stop you right there for a second? That
Yeah.
a bunch of us here are in the Boston area,
yeah,
and there's a rent control proposal that's going to be a referendum on the ballot. And all those arguments of does it work to keep rents affordable, or does it discourage building or cause landlords to flee? That all those arguments are happening very publicly in Boston right now.
Well, I do think that rent control discourages the building of low-cost rental housing.
Yeah.
I do. I mean, what's the solution? Have the government build it. Don't depend on the private sector. Build it yourself. But I think one has to acknowledge that people in the private sector who go into housing do it to make money. And Engels wrote about this a million years ago. The fundamental problem is working people aren't paid enough. That's the real fundamental problem in housing. Working people aren't paid enough. It's expensive to build and maintain good decent housing. And lots of people who work really hard just don't get enough money to do that, And so it's a tough equation to square if you're doing it on a profit-making basis.
Josh, you you covered some of this, but from the outside, it appears that Mamdani administration has gotten off to a pretty good start with his sewer socialism cleanup of the snow, which in Chicago that eliminated one mayor. So, can you give us an idea? You lived in New York almost all your life and been observing city politics. What should we expect from Mamdani?
Yeah. It's hard to say. He's only been mayor 3 months. First of all, what you said is not unimportant. He's made no unforced errors, and that, he's this 34-year-old kid and he's suddenly the mayor, and he's really handled himself with great poise and dealt with things like 2 massive snowstorms. And he's a breath of fresh air. The guy loves New York. He loves its working people. He knows New York the way no mayor in my lifetime has known it. He knows every nook and cranny of working class neighborhoods. He's been in the debates against Andrew Cuomo. At one point, that wasn't actually Mamdani. Someone asked Cuomo, what mosques did you visit when you were the governor? He was governor for 10 years. He couldn't name a single one. Mamdani's been in every mosque and synagogue in all of New York, and it's very refreshing and people really like it. And he's brilliantly at communicating. And so far, he's got a lot of goodwill, How much of a break from, good liberal urban democratic politics will this be? Will it really be something beyond that? I think it's a little hard to measure. The appointments and the policies have been a mixed bag so far. He's made a couple extraordinary appointments. He appointed someone who I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, former Labor Secretary Julie Su, has been appointed the Deputy Mayor for Economic Justice. I mean, I didn't think I'd live to see New York City having a deputy mayor for economic justice, let alone someone as formidable as Julie Su. For the Department of Corrections, and we have a nightmare prison system in New York. It's so inhuman. It's horrible. He appointed a former incarcerated guy named Stanley Richards, who's headed the Fortune Society, which is the organization that tries to help people released from prison. He's now the Commissioner of Corrections in New York. Those are extraordinary, but they're actually not typical. Most of these appointed very competent, liberal, progressive bureaucrats. I think he feels like he needs to prove that he can make the machinery work. He's kept quite a conservative police commissioner in place, and I think that it's potentially kind of problematic. So we'll see. I think that what he is trying to do is to prioritize the issues he ran on and to make them actually happen. So everyone in New York knows what they are, because all he did for 6 months was repeat them, and everyone loved it and he got elected mayor. So it's universal free childcare, right? It's the rent freeze and free buses. These are the 3 big things. And I think he's saving his political capital to use on those. With the idea, if you could pull off that, then you could really take off. And I think on universal free childcare, he's already moving forward. Now, will it be as big depends upon whether or not he can get a tax the rich program that has to go through the state legislature. Unclear, but it's a big fight. But even without that, that's going to move forward. Rent freeze is going to happen. Free buses, that's also going to be a tough one because he doesn't control the transit system. But that's like an independent state-run authority. But I think, he's going to try really hard. So I think he's being shrewd. I think he's being strategic. Not everyone in his own world loves this. Inside DSA, there are 2 things going on. One is everyone says, let's give the guy a chance. But there's also a lot of people going like, is this democratic socialism? Is this enough? But everyone's kind of, I think everyone's trying to say, let's just wait and see. So I am cautiously optimistic. It's a very tough road. New York City, like a lot of cities, has limited power. A lot of the power about taxation and lawmaking on the state level. So it's not an easy thing to take on. But so far, he's doing great. He really is. And it's just fun. Like I'll just give you one more example and I'll stop because you can see I'm enthusiastic. So, used to be when I was a kid, when it snowed, they closed the schools, snow day, the best thing on the world. We haven't had it in about 10 years in New York, because it has to do with the state funding and you certain people. So the last snowstorm, Mamdani said, snow days are great. Everyone stay home. We had a snow day. Everyone loved it. Then the second day, the next day, like all the kids are going, we want another snow day. So Mamdani has this press conference, he goes, you can't have another snow day, but I'm gonna go outside and you can all throw snowballs at me. So like that's the kind of populist image making he's doing, and I'm a sucker for it. So we'll see how it goes.
Josh, let's go back to the national level. The current housing crisis has two forms. One is the lack of affordable housing, and the other is the high cost of the housing that there is. And therefore, those, of course, are related. If you were put in charge, and this is the federal government now, what are the first one, two, or three things that you do? And you had a big Democrat majority or something.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know. The budget request for Iran's going to be 200 billion. You can actually build a lot of units of housing with $200 billion. So I would go back to the New Deal. The New Deal, it's interesting. The New Deal started building housing not because it cared about housing. It did, but that's not why it did it. It did it to create jobs because it was in the middle of a depression. And that's the politics of housing back then. Now, right now, we're in a much better economy than in 1933. So you can't win a housing program based on that. So it's a hard thing to do. But to me, I would like to see state money, taxpayer money, used to fund building housing that's permanently out of the marketplace. That every 20 years, you don't have to fight to keep the same thing. In New York, we have all kinds of programs for affordable housing, and they're all time limited. And so 20 years later, they all go back into the market, and you're fighting to keep the number the same by building new ground of it. So I would build permanent non-market housing. And how you do that, I think, can be done a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be the old style public housing. I would go back to that very early experiment to see if churches and unions and other groups, cooperatives could sponsor housing. Try a lot of different things. And at some point, though, the market does work. If you build new housing, it just does eventually put downward pressure on rents because, the landlords no longer have as much of a monopoly. So I think that's certainly one thing that I would start with, and it's funny. I just wrote a book review about a woman named Mary K. Simkovich, who no one's ever heard of, but she was a settlement house leader and a big public housing advocate in the starting in the early 20th century up until the 1960s. And she was not a socialist. She was like a blue blood Protestant settlement house type. But she said that housing should be a basic right, like access to water and air, and that the private sector could not and would not provide it, and therefore the government should, And I would go back to that. Roosevelt said the same thing in his Economic Bill of Rights. Today, saying that puts you on the far end of a radical perspective. But I think we need to go back to that. And every unit of permanent non-market housing is one family you don't have to worry about in the future. So that would be my stress if I was the czar. That's what I do.
Yeah, let's make you the czar for sure. It's been interesting watching, affordability become the watchword, and what the Democrats think that's how they're going to win elections, is to keep talking about affordability. And I think it's it's sharpening right now with the oil prices, with the war shooting gas prices up, that the number of things that have become, and with the healthcare, not renewing the healthcare subsidies, the number of things that have become severely unaffordable has very recently shot up. So I'm hopeful that the political will can emerge to address the housing crisis, but also the other affordability crises. So do you have hope or ways of generating the political will
Yeah.
to bring costs down?
I think that's a mixed story. I am a little bit hopeful. There are some interesting things going on that maybe haven't gotten so much publicity. There are a few places in the country that have adopted this idea of social housing, that the government should be involved in creating below market rate rental housing for people of modest means. Montgomery County, Maryland's got a program like that. Seattle's got a program. LA has actually got a program like that. So a few things are happening. Mamdani getting elected on this, freeze the rent program. That's very good. I think one sign of this actually was Trump's call to limit corporate ownership of single family homes, which, I don't disagree with that idea. I think he just did it because he had nothing else to offer on affordability. But it's a sign, I think, that there is some pressure building on housing affordability. I have to say the other side of it, though, is there's never been a mass housing movement in the United States. There have been some really wonderful activists and reform groups, and there have been moments when they've seized the opportunity and had a lot of influence. But they have not been really mass movements. The only really big mass movements in the United States about housing have been anti-eviction movements, but they're not about constructing new housing. And groups that, in my view, should be taking up this issue, like unions, rarely do. And if they do, it's in a very modest sort of way. So I don't think there's going to be a housing movement that's just a housing movement that's going to be powerful enough. So I think if change happens, it's going to be part of a larger set of reconfigurations of our political life. Just like in New York, with Mamdani housing, sure, but that's just part of a bigger story. And I'm as much of as dark as anyone else. Are we on the cusp of that, or is that like some just insane pipe dream? I have no idea.
We're getting some interesting questions and comments in the chat. Why don't we open it up for discussion? Let's see looks like I can do this. Good. So yeah, if you have questions for Josh, and the discussion questions that Jack and I thought of were that one we were just talking about. What would it take to generate the political will to solve the housing crisis at whatever state and local area you're in now? Obviously, nothing's happening at the federal level right now, but in the future. So yeah, you can unmute yourself and speak, or put a comment in the chat, or raise your virtual hand. Lisa, you had a question in the chat. Do you want to ask it out loud?
Sure. I was wondering, do you think changing the AMI formula would help make things more affordable? Because that building affordable housing is really not affordable, and it's really results from the AMI. If you had the opportunity, would you change that on a federal level?
Do you want to define AMI for those who may not know it?
Area medium income.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a level of which I'm not an expert on, but it's been a big issue in a lot of places, because the technical way you define that can have a huge impact on people's lives. So, in New York over the last 20 years, the sort of neoliberal solution, which was adopted also by a lot of progressives, is you have zoning. You say to a developer, who wants to build more than the zoning allows, okay, we'll let you do that, but in effect, we're going to tax you by saying you also have to build 27% of your units as affordable. And I think that whole model is problematic anyway. But then the issue is what's affordable. And for a long time, like the AMI, well, what's the area you're using? It's not the little specific neighborhood you're building in. It might be the whole city or the whole state. So, what may be affordable by that formula, or like 60% of the AMI, may be, an income level way above what the actual average income in that neighborhood is. So, all kinds of people who make much more than the current residents will move into the so-called affordable housing. So it's just accelerating the gentrification that the whole project is doing in the first place. If everyone's lost by what I just said, so am I. It gets very complicated. So I think the answer to Lisa is yes, but it has to be done by people who know a heck of a lot more than I do about how to do it. But I just think, I don't even like that whole approach. I think the whole approach should be for, originally public housing was not conceived of something just for poor people. It was, it was conceived of as something for a broad range of people, the sort of bottom half or the bottom 2/3 of the housing market. And I think that's just a much better approach than, fighting over who's poor enough or who isn't for these projects. But in the short run, we're stuck with that. And I think, Lisa, you make a really good point.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Anybody want to unmute and speak, or put something in the chat, or raise your hand?
Yeah.
Can I say something? It's Lisa.
Sure, go ahead.
What would be your approach to NYCHA's housing issues? They need a lot of repair.
Yeah. This is a huge problem, and it's a really big problem. I'll just tell you one little, I was going to say funny, it's not really funny. I mentioned earlier that the city was doing these, rental ripoff forums. They scheduled the first forum, and people were supposed to come and complain about their landlord. And all these NYCHA residents said, you're our landlord. You're ripping us off. We want to come. And it wasn't set up for NYCHA residents. And people started going to like Trump, not to Mamdani, what's wrong with you? Like, you're the landlord now, and how come you're shutting us up? And then the mayor kind of retreated and said, oh, yes, you're welcome to complain too. New York has about 500,000 units of public housing. Everyone ripped it down in the rest of the country. New York never did. It's barely ever ripped down a unit of public housing. There's hundreds of thousands of people on the waiting list. So it's still considered a real social asset, but it's in terrible shape. It's the result of massive underfunding. A great deal of this is the result of the federal government, but some of it from state and local government underfunding it too. And as I said earlier, it's something that doesn't have a political constituency. So what do you do about it? Frankly, I don't think the mayor's got much of a strategy. The main strategy of recent years is to try to do public-private partnerships where they effectively turn over management to private entities who can take care of all kinds of financial shenanigans and tax advantages if they invest some capital. In some cases, that also proposed involving building new buildings, maybe market rate buildings on excess land in public housing. And this is quite controversial. I think it's a real dilemma for public housing residents because what they got now stinks, and they're really cynical about the likelihood of the government stepping in to meet the problems. On the other hand, the alternative is very uncertain and unknown. So they've been having elections among residents in specific projects about do they want to join these various experimental private public partnerships, some of which are federal, by the way. They're not just local arrangements. And the votes have been pretty mixed. The project near me just had a vote the other day, and they decided to stay in the traditional public housing. So this is going to require massive capital investment. And, frankly, no one's really come up with an explanation where that money would come from. So I think Mamdani has committed some money to meet. I'll give you an example. I mean, Mamdani said we're going to allocate money to put heat pumps in, I don't know, I think it was something like 10,000 units, which is great. It's like modern, it works and so forth, but it's 10,000 out of 500,000, and where are you going to get the money for the other 490,000, So I think it's a real problem, and no one wants to, politically, it's like, it's not something that people have really engaged with, because no one has a good answer.
Other questions or opinions? Yes, Suzanne.
Well, I can just share that here in Cleveland Heights, they had a contest to create standardized designs for accessory dwelling units as a way to increase affordable housing here. And so I'm eager to sort of see if people take advantage of that. I see a lot of very large empty mansions in my city. We're sort of an old city, and I just think about all that wasted housing and how do you take a big old place like that and make it something that can house more people?
That's great.
I went to the Havana Jazz Festival about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's the only time I've been to Cuba. I was just there very briefly. I went to go, but Havana was full of those old mansions, and if you stayed after the revolution, you kept it. No one expropriated anything. But if you left, they divide them up. So Cleveland should send someone to Havana, because they have a lot of experience turning beautiful old mansions into apartment buildings. It's all over the whole city.
I mean, I'll call on myself, since I don't see other hands, that,
Joel.
go ahead, Joel. You go first.
Yeah, thank you first. It's just so wonderful what you shared. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about kind of from the New Deal, what the politics were. You said a little bit about it, but more, the way in which somebody like Frances Perkins, what she was able to do, and the way in which the left, the communists, the hidden communists, and that kind of popular front, what that meant in government, the way politically something like this could happen. I mean, you also had the ILGWU co-ops going on, the coups in the Bronx, the communist and the other coups. So just that kind, and anything more to say about the politics of that time that allowed something like this to happen?
Yeah, let me just say a couple things about it. I mean, I think the very beginning moment is really interesting because, as I said, the housing program was an offshoot of the economic recovery program. And that, above all, was designed to put people back to work, and also in certain aspects to bail out the banks that had mortgages that were in trouble. And so the idea is to move quickly and create these very big bureaucracies to do this. But, there was very few people who had any idea how you do any of this, So, housing reformers were turned to, Now, of course, Roosevelt was sympathetic to this. The head of the PWA was Harold Ickes, who was a longtime Chicago progressive, had been the head of the Chicago NAACP. And they turned to all these people who had been trying for 20 years, pretty unsuccessfully, to bring European models of social housing to the United States. And suddenly, these were the people that had high positions in the housing bureaucracy. So, and they were like ready to go. They had thought about this for years when they were out of power. So this moment happened, which enabled a small group of people only known in the world of housing reform to have a fair amount of power. Then the issue is, well, what do you do in the long run? Do you have a permanent government housing program, or do you just have this thing as a spin-off of recovery, and when recovery happens, you step out of housing again? And that fight takes place during the New Deal. and isn't settled until 1937, when the United States Housing Authority is set up. And that is a political battle royal in which the progressives lose. That the conservative elements in Congress and the real estate industry and the financial groups that they were linked to intervened when a capacious, broad progressive housing program was proposed. And they whittled it down, they whittled it down, they whittled it down. So the original program was supposed to fund co-op housing, experimental projects, as well as government projects. It was supposed to be for a broad income range. By the time the bill was actually passed in 1937, what we got was only a program that funded, local housing authorities to build housing for poor people, and there were spending caps built into the law. How much could you spend per unit in building public housing? And those spending caps were lower than the spending caps the government had used on the earlier projects, like that one the Union built in Philadelphia. So by 1937, public housing, after this brief flowering, was positioned as substandard housing for the poor, and that was a political battle where the left, if you want to call it that, lost basically, and some unions engaged in that battle, but not so much. The Communist Party was not that attuned to these issues. It was really these housing reformers whose roots were almost in the progressive movement as much as in the left of the time. The unions in New York built co-op housing, and that was very, very advanced. They didn't really become players on the national level till World War II, when they became more insistent, particularly for defense workers, that these people should get decent housing. And there was a period in the 40s where a number of unions, including the UAW, were pretty active in promoting public housing. In some cases, they built their own housing. So there's a little flurry of that activity. But, really the battle, in my view, was basically lost, because I think, the opponents were so strong. And I'm going to go on, but I don't want to.
I think we have another hand up. Lucy,
one more sentence.
one more sentence. Okay.
I was trying to think, like, why is there so much European, social housing, good housing built from World War I to World War II and not in the United States? And some of it is the left is stronger in Europe, but a big piece of it is that the real estate industry is much weaker in Europe. The real estate industry in the United States is gigantically powerful. And it's more powerful today than ever, at least in New York. And it's tough to beat those guys.
Yeah, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi, my name's Lucid. I'm from the Twin Cities. And yeah, I guess I'm curious because I do a lot of stuff with tenant unions and tenant associations. And so I guess kind of going off of what you were talking about like who are these big advocates? How do you see like tenant unions and tenants building power fitting into what you've been talking about?
Yeah, I only know about New York State. And in New York City, there's been a persistent, very long-term effort to organize tenants. And I think it's paid off. It's built slowly, but there's now a network. Some of it is individual buildings where some individual problem exists and an organizer comes in, or people themselves, organize a group, a tenants union, whatever. But there's been more and more banding together, and that's become a huge political player on the state level. And those groups together, organized statewide, succeeded in getting, for example, something that's called just cause eviction. You can no longer just evict someone in New York State because you don't like them. You actually have to have a reason. That's a huge, in my view, intervention against property rights, which is a good thing, in this case, a very good thing. So I think that there's a tremendous potential power in, they've just organized like a political lobbying group that can make political contributions as parallel to the tenants union in New York State. So I think that's hugely important. And I think, the ability of someone like Mamdani to do a rent freeze, it's not just because he's like a good guy. It's because people have spent years, organizing tenants and making them a political force that everyone has to reckon with.
I'm thinking about this from the movement building point of view, and I was a tenant organizer of one complex at a time, successfully. But there's a principle in social movement theory that people mobilize and go into effective political action when they have contact with each other. So to me, that makes sense that you're in a building or an apartment complex and you all know you can know each other, you all have the same problems, and so that can work. But so many of our housing problems, the people do not have a way of being in touch with each other. And I really watched this and analyzed this during the Great Recession, when something like 750,000 people got foreclosed on and lost the homes that they owned. Also, tenants got kicked out when the banks took them over. And that it was so outrageous to have that many people and who were all paid up with their rent or their mortgage just have their homes and their equity ripped away. And there was no big organized movement about that, because which makes sense, because how would they know each other? First of all, they're in crisis, they're having to move or whatever, but also there's nothing to put them in touch with each other. And so I think we have that now, that the people are struggling with unaffordable housing. Similarly, where's the movement of all the people who just lost their health insurance, or their health insurance became insanely expensive to them? Nobody's organizing them. So when the harm is very, very dispersed, I don't, if anybody has any signs of hope of how do you in those cases organize people to be a political force for the solutions to their really extreme problems, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, let me just say something. It's a little tangential, but it's related, because I think you make a really important point. Garden apartments were designed to be more communal and collective than most American housing. This was deliberate. I mean, courtyards were meant to be places where people would meet their neighbors and hang out with one another. So they were conducive to organization. And garden apartments, they always had Boy Scout troops and Girl Scout troops and this club and that club. It was very dense networks. And there were a number of things I write about in my book, some from the 1970s, when developers bought these garden apartment like including that one in LA, for example. By the 1970s, they're aging. They're in places like Venice, which the land has now become very valuable, and they want to rip them down and build new, more profitable buildings. And there are these monumental struggles by the tenants to resist. There's one in Lincoln Place. There's another place called Windsor Ward in east of downtown, and they win. These are like epic struggles. They go on for years, and some of it is the physical design. People feel very viscerally a sense of community. They see each other every day. They share the laundry room. There's a kind of network. So, and that was a kind of it was a conception of what a democratic society should be. And most suburban single-family tract housing was the opposite conception. A good life is one of privacy. You have your own backyard. You put a fence up. You put a hedge so that no one could see over the fence. They're different visions of what the good life is. And and ironically, as you're saying, like you could get the economic disaster in the private vision, and you're less well equipped to fight than if you're in the urban apartment building or the garden apartment.
Yeah, when I was a tenant organizer, two of the complexes that where they did do a tenant buyout and they're now permanently affordable tenant managed housing. They were shaped, they weren't as nice as the garden apartments you showed us, but they were shaped like that so that everybody could meet each other. Joni's got her hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say my partner is a housing advocate and has been for 25 years working with City Life Leader Obama. Unfortunately, he was fired from there last year, but and his partner was as well, Cefiro. And they have now been organizing to such an extent that they're getting lots of victories of tenants organizations that they're starting outside of Boston and areas around the city. And Cefiro has started working for Mass Union of Public Housing and now has over 115 places that she's been organizing tenants in public housing. And basically, it's really clear that when you have people talking to one another, they go canvassing every weekend and they're talking to each other and they're saying, let's do something about the rats. Let's do something about the rent increases. Let's do something about this horrible landlord that keeps threatening us. And they have had so many victories in the last year. It's just been really incredible. Steve has started an alliance with others, the tenant leaders that he had worked with before. And now they have an alliance called Housing Justice Alliance. And they're building such amazing power through tenant organizing. So it's very exciting.
Fantastic.
I'm going to be a little off topic here, but I'm just curious. Several of my relatives are on Section 8, and I live in a pretty nice suburb where a lot of apartment buildings, people are on Section 8. Section 8, the government pays a portion of your rent to the landlord based on your income. So it seems to me like a very good program that disperses low income people. And we spend about $40 billion a year on it, and that only covers 1 out of 4 people who are eligible for it. So that's what is $120 billion to cover everybody else, which isn't a lot of money. A couple of days of war, but is there a better way? I mean, I know that doesn't increase supply, but it does make things affordable, and goes back to your point about workers are not paid enough. That's a form of social wage. Would that be a good way to spend $120 billion for housing? Use it expanding Section 8 for everybody who's eligible?
Yeah, that for me, that's a tough question because I think there's a very practical, immediate issue and there's a deeper philosophical issue, that I think you could provide in our country, we have a history of providing social benefits multiple ways. And some of it, it is direct government provision of that social benefit. And some is to give people basically money to buy the service in the marketplace, And my inclination is towards the first, but it often doesn't work. I mean, it's the same debate about the VA services now, I mean, it's conservatives are making the argument, but they have an argument that says, well, why shouldn't you just give veterans money and they should be able to pick their own doctor and go everywhere they want? And let's get rid of this bureaucracy. Section 8 was that idea for housing. It was the replacement, in a sense, for public housing. And it had some really positive sides to it, which I think you mentioned. And I would be foolish to, cast those in a negative light. But is that the long-term way I would invest money if I was creating a housing program? I think the answer is no, I wouldn't.
Okay.
Maybe we're coming to the end of our time. Should we wrap up and thank Josh for doing this? You want to put up your little reaction emojis or unmute and say, thank you. This is like so juicy.
Yeah.
Uh,
And
Beth, can you stop sharing so we can see each other?
yeah, let me just do the one more slide and then I will. I want to make sure to announce, Working Class Studies Association, this is a bi-monthly series, and you can see all the old ones at classmatters.org/events. And so the May one is, I think, going to be really interesting. It's with a UAW organizer called Garrett Shishido Strain. And he's taking the lessons from the Flint sit-down strikes in the 30s and making lessons for, building up working class competence to win strikes and elections and everything. So I think it's going to be very timely and very juicy. So,
and he's organized both higher ed, some 40,000 research workers, and auto workers in Chattanooga and Alabama. So he's got quite a range of experience.
I'll put the registration link into the chat. But okay, if you want to set it to seeing everyone, set your visibility. So yeah, any more closing statements or thanks?
No, I just want to thank you for inviting me. This is so much fun to talk with such a well-informed and interesting group. So thank you very much for inviting me to join you.
Oh yeah, we were thrilled that you were up for doing it.
Thank you for giving garden apartments their due. I had a wonderful childhood growing up there.
Yeah. Well, I used to describe this project, I would say that, they were the Rodney Dangerfield of housing. They got no respect. And then I realized like 90% of the world is too young to get the joke. So
But Josh, did you say you lived at this? Can I ask a personal question?
Sure.
Did you say, it's not really germane to the topic per se, but you said you lived in garden apartments called Grand Central?
Yeah, it's not called that anymore. They changed the name. It's now called Parkwood Estates. These names are really funny. I've often thought about these names. It's like someone wanted to deny any tinge of radical roots for these places. So they come up with these ridiculous names, like they sound like they're English country estates or something, So, but it was a small garden apartment. Do you know Glen Oaks, which is a very big?
No, I grew up in Parkway Village, so we were right on Grand Central Parkway, which is why we were called that.
One of the most famous of all these, because I have this wonderful photo in the book of Betty Friedan at her son's birthday party in the courtyard at Parkway Village, and it's so funny because everyone thinks of Betty Friedan being very unhappy with post-war American life, but she loved Parkway Village. She said she was never...
I have to tell you a great story about Betty Friedan. So by the time I lived there, Betty Friedan didn't live there anymore in Parkway Village. She had moved off, but people in Parkway still knew her. And my mother went to a party in the 60s, right? And somebody was there and she said, "My friend Betty, who used to live here, is writing a book and it's going to change the world." And everybody went, "Oh, sure. Yeah, right. Everybody always thinks that."
Yeah.
But it was true.
Can I tell the story of Parkway Village for 1 second? Because it's so fascinating.
I mean,
Parkway
let's just say,
let's let people go.
Anybody who needs to leave. No, we can.
No. Let's just stay.
Yeah, anybody who needs to leave,
What's the
we'll say
right?
good
What's the
night.
right?
Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you
going.
another month. But yeah, those of us who want to hang and chat, that's fine.
I'll just give it because Parkway Village is a completely fascinating place. When New York City was trying to get the UN to set up its headquarters after World War II in New York, part of the deal was they said, we'll accommodate the delegates and the staff. We'll create housing. And there were two big housing projects, one by Metropolitan Life and one by another life insurance company, and that's where they're going to, lease a block of units to house the delegates and the staff. And these life insurance companies refused to agree to rent the apartments on a non-discriminatory basis. In other words, they wouldn't let delegates and staff from Africa and Asia
Oh, gee.
live in these projects. So New York City was kind of screwed. They had to do something. So they got a private developer. This is Robert Moses, who everyone thinks is the devil, got a private developer to build Parkway Village, which the UN then leased the whole place for its staff and for delegates. And they didn't need all of it, so that the ones they didn't use were then rented out to anyone who wanted to. And over time, eventually, it just became another garden apartment. But its very reason for existence was to be racially integrated, because you couldn't find a big block of racially integrated. So, when Ralph Bunche won the Nobel Prize, he was living in Parkway Village. He was living in a garden apartment. So, you could live in a garden apartment and win the Nobel Peace Prize, it turns out, because of this. So it's a real testament to both American racism and, an effort to overcome it, both.
Jack, I realize that we failed to enthuse about this book, which is full of juicy stories like that, that we recommend reading Garden Apartments because there's a lot of history, but there's just a lot of lore too.
I mean,
I'm not going to go. I could go on forever, but anyway, it's great to hear about your
the MetLife, the Stuyvesant Cooper, town and village. I mean, that spirit, just the names, and my mother had a dance studio there in the 50s, and all her clients, and it was integrated. She was a pinko in the new dance group, as she called herself. But it was a remarkable place. We knew we had friends there, and it seems like there's something still. I mean, the name of it alone, and the spirit that you're describing, the post-war spirit of New York, and that kind of popular front as it goes into the, Did you do MetLife? I mean, MetLife seems to, even though it's the insurance companies, it's still there's some that progressive sensibility seems to be imbued on some level in names, or maybe not.
Yeah, it's a slightly more complicated story because it was integrated against the will of Metropolitan Life. But they did think that building good affordable housing was a good, safe investment. Insurance companies need to think in 50 and 100 years. What do we need capital 100 years from now? And they thought housing was a good way to do it, and it benefited a lot of people.
All right, have we come to our natural end? Nobody else is burning to say something.
Thanks a lot.
Great. Well, I appreciate everybody who hung in here, and especially appreciate you, Josh. This was really fascinating.